A single dad walks through the factory parking lot late at night. When he sees a CEO alone in her car, crying, he thinks it's just stress until she opens up a secret that could destroy not only the factory, but the entire town that depends on it. Instead of walking away, he makes a choice to fight for his family, his neighbors, and the strangers everyone else had given up on. But what she reveals next isn't just about business. It's about hidden battles, buried injustices, and a second chance no one saw coming. Together, they'll face betrayal, sabotage, and the risk of losing everything unless they can turn pain into hope. So, the question is, can two broken people rewrite the fate of an entire community, or will the truth tear them apart forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The sodium lights cast long shadows across the Riverview Plastics parking lot as Dan Whitaker made his final walkthrough of the evening. 25 years of routine had trained his eyes to spot anything out of place. Tonight, something was different. A black Mercedes sat alone under the farthest light pole, its elegant shape a stark contrast to the worn pickup trucks and practical sedans that usually filled these spaces. The car's interior lights were dimmed, but he could make out a figure inside. Dan's steps slowed. He knew that car. It belonged to CEO Tasha Brooks. She'd visited the plant twice in the past month, all stern efficiency and pressed suits. But something wasn't right. Her shoulders were shaking. She was crying. Dan hesitated, his thermos of coffee warm in his hand. The distance between a line supervisor and a CEO seemed as wide as the empty parking lot. But the sight of someone in pain tugged at him, titles or no titles. He approached carefully, making his footsteps audible on the cracked asphalt. When he reached the driver's side window, he could see her clearly, head bowed, hands covering her face. His gentle tap on the glass made her start. Tasha Brooks quickly wiped her eyes, trying to reconstruct her professional mask. But the tear tracks on her cheeks caught the orange glow of the parking lot lights. Dan held up his thermos with an apologetic smile. "Sorry to startle you, Ms. Brooks. Thought you might need some coffee. It's getting cold out here." She stared at him for a long moment, seeming to weigh something heavy in her mind. Then, with a soft whir, the window rolled down. "Mr. Whitaker, isn't it?" Her voice was steady, despite the remnants of tears. "Third shift supervisor?" "Yes, ma'am." "Dan's fine, though." He unscrewed the thermos cap and poured some coffee into it, offering it to her. "It's nothing fancy, just break room brew with a splash of cream." She accepted the makeshift cup with both hands, as if seeking its warmth. "Thank you. I didn't think anyone was still here. I always do one last walk around before heading home. Make sure everything's locked up tight." Dan shifted his weight, uncertain whether to stay or go. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" Tasha took a sip of coffee, then gave a laugh that sounded more like a sob. "No, Mr. Whitaker, Dan. Everything is very far from okay." The raw honesty in her voice made him forget about hierarchy. Here was just another person having a rough night. He'd seen plenty of those in his years as a shift supervisor, as a father, as a widower. "Would you like to talk about it?" he offered quietly. "Sometimes it helps to tell someone who's not involved." She looked at him for a long moment, then gestured to the passenger side. "Would you mind?" Dan walked around and slid into the leather seat, the luxury of it making him acutely aware of his work boots and faded jeans. The interior smelled of vanilla and something expensive. "Your coffee's actually better than what I get at the corporate office," Tasha said, attempting a smile. "The secret's in the pot we never quite get clean," Dan replied, earning a small chuckle. They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for a few minutes, sharing the thermos cap back and forth. The factory's massive shape loomed before them, its windows dark except for the safety lights. "I love this view," Tasha said suddenly. "Do you know what I see when I look at this plant, Dan?" He shook his head, watching her profile in the dim light. "I see 342 families. I see mortgages being paid, children going to college, Christmas presents under trees." Her voice caught. "I see the kind of opportunity my father never had, working as a janitor his whole life." Dan felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Miss Brooks, please, call me Tasha." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Tomorrow morning, I have to stand in front of those 342 families and tell them this plant is closing." The words hit Dan like a physical blow. He thought of his daughter Maddie's college fund, of Tommy in shipping with his new baby, of Maria, in quality control, supporting her sick mother. "But we're meeting our numbers," he said. "Quality's up, safety incidents are down. We just got that new contract. The board has made their decision." Tasha's knuckles were white around the thermos cap. "They say the plant is underperforming, that the risk factors are too high. But I've seen the real numbers, the patterns in who gets promoted, who gets the training opportunities." She took a shaky breath. "This isn't about performance. This is about prejudice dressed up in corporate language." Dan thought about his crew, about the subtle ways some workers got passed over, about the invisible lines that divided the break room at lunch. He'd noticed, but had he done enough? "How many jobs?" he asked quietly. "All of them. Within 60 days. Tasha's professional composure cracked completely. "I fought them, Dan. I presented alternative plans, showed them the community impact studies. But I'm just the CEO they brought in to make their diversity numbers look good. When I push too hard, they remind me how lucky I am to have this position at all." The anger in Dan's chest surprised him with its intensity. He thought of his late wife saying that silence in the face of wrong was its own kind of wrong. "There has to be something we can do," he said, his mind already racing through possibilities. Tasha wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. "I've run out of options. I've run out of time." She glanced at her watch and straightened her shoulders, the CEO mask slipping back into place. "I should go. The announcement is at 9 tomorrow morning. Ms. Brooks." "Tasha," Dan said, his hand on the door handle. "Thank you for telling me the truth." She gave him a sad smile. "Thank you for the coffee, Dan, and for being kind enough to stop." She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow, I have to announce the plant's closure." Steam curled from the thermos cap as Dan poured coffee into it. The rich aroma filled the car's interior, mixing with the leather seat's subtle scent. Tasha Brooks wrapped her fingers around the warm metal, her perfect manicure catching the dim parking lot light. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steadier now. "I don't usually. This isn't like me." "We all have those moments, ma'am." Dan stood awkwardly by her open window, his own coffee forgotten in his hand. "Sometimes a rough day just catches up with you." Tasha took a small sip and looked up at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but clear. "Do you know what the hardest part of leadership is, Mr. Whitaker?" "Dan, please," he said. "And, no, I suppose I don't. It's when you see good people about to be hurt, and you're expected to be the one wielding the knife." She set the coffee down carefully in the cup holder. "The board is closing Riverview Plastics. They want me to announce it tomorrow morning." The words hit Dan like a physical blow. He steadied himself against the car door, grateful for its solid support. "Closing? But we just landed the Miller contract. Production is up this quarter." "Not up enough, according to them." Tasha's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "But that's not the whole truth. I've spent the last week reviewing every performance metric, every training record, every promotion decision for the past 5 years. What I found." She shook her head. "It's a pattern, Dan. A shameful one. I'm not sure I follow. Who gets the advanced training opportunities here? Who gets tapped for leadership roles? Look at your shift supervisors. Notice anything about who they tend to be." Her voice carried no accusation, only a deep weariness. "The numbers are down because we've systematically overlooked good people, kept them stuck, wasted their potential because they didn't fit someone's idea of who belongs where." Dan felt his face grow warm. He'd noticed things over the years, comments in break rooms, qualified people passed over, subtle ways certain workers got harder assignments or less support, but he'd never connected it to the bigger picture. "The board sees falling metrics and calls it a failing plant," Tasha continued. "They don't see, or don't want to see, how their own biases created those numbers. It's easier to close us down than face that truth." A car passed on the distant street, its headlights sweeping across them. In that brief illumination, Dan saw the weight of responsibility in Tasha's expression, the fierce intelligence behind her careful words. "Unless," she said slowly, "we could prove them wrong." "How?" "I might be able to buy us 30 days. 1 month to show what this plant can really do when everyone gets a fair chance to excel." She turned to face him fully. "But I'd need help. I'd need people willing to challenge the old ways, mentor new talent, stand up to prejudice both subtle and direct." Dan thought of his shift crew, the young Hispanic worker whose innovative process suggestion had been ignored, the older black woman whose decades of experience were routinely dismissed, the former Marine who couldn't seem to get promoted despite perfect performance reviews. 30 days isn't much time, he said. "No, but sometimes that's all you need to start changing hearts and minds. To show what's possible when you believe in people." Tasha's voice grew stronger. "I can fight the board, Dan. I can make the business case. But I need proof, real numbers showing what happens when we give everyone a true shot at success." The night air had grown cooler, carrying the first hints of autumn. Dan thought of his daughter Maddie's college fund, built one overtime shift at a time. He thought of Jorge in shipping, supporting 3 kids on his line workers' pay. Of Miss Ruby in quality control, just 2 years from retirement. Of dozens of families whose lives hung in the balance. "What exactly would you need?" he asked. "People willing to learn and teach, to prove that excellence knows no color or age." Tasha's eyes held his. "Would you help me try, Dan? Would you stand with me?" The weight of the moment pressed around them like a physical thing. Dan looked across the parking lot, at the factory building where he'd spent half his life. Its walls held thousands of stories, of struggle and triumph, of small kindnesses and daily perseverance. He couldn't let it end like this. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll help." Tasha's shoulders relaxed slightly, the first tension leaving them since he'd approached her car. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll see you tomorrow then. Early meeting, before the shift change." Dan stepped back, giving her space to leave. He watched the Mercedes's taillights disappear into the night, then began his walk home. The streets were quiet, most houses dark except for porch lights. A dog barked in the distance. His footsteps echoed off brick walls and concrete. With each step, he thought about the people who filled those houses, his neighbors, his co-workers, their children. Every one of them connected to Riverview Plastics in some way. Every one of them deserving of a fair chance. He thought of Maddie, how she'd taught him to see the world through younger, clearer eyes, how she'd shown him that change was possible, necessary, right. 30 days. It wasn't much time to reshape decades of ingrained habits and hidden prejudices, but it was a start, and sometimes, Dan knew, that was all you needed, just enough time to prove what was possible when people chose to do better. Sunlight streamed through the worn checkered curtains of Dan's kitchen, casting a familiar pattern across the scratched linoleum floor. The morning routine was the same as always. Scrambled eggs sizzling in the pan, toast popping up with a cheerful ding, and Maddie sitting at their small table with her schoolbooks spread out. But something was different. Dan couldn't shake the weight of last night's conversation from his shoulders as he moved around the kitchen, his movements a little slower, more distracted than usual. "Dad, you're burning the eggs," Maddie pointed out, looking up from her social studies homework. Dan blinked and quickly scraped the slightly browned eggs onto 2 plates. "Just a little crispy, adds character," he said with a forced smile. Maddie watched him with those observant eyes that reminded him so much of her mother. At 12, she had a way of seeing right through him that sometimes caught him off guard. She pushed her long brown hair behind her ears, a gesture she'd picked up from Sarah before she passed, and tilted her head. "Something's wrong," she said. It wasn't a question. Dan set their plates down and took his seat across from her. The kitchen felt smaller, suddenly, more confined. "Not wrong exactly, sweetheart. Just, there might be some changes coming at work." "Bad changes?" Maddie poked at her eggs with her fork. Dan reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Hey, don't worry. Your old dad's got things under control." He tried to sound more confident than he felt. "Mom always said you were terrible at hiding when you're worried." Maddie's voice was quiet but sure. The mention of Sarah made Dan's chest tighten. She had been right about that, like she was right about so many things. He took a deep breath. Listen, Mads. Sometimes grown-ups have to handle complicated stuff. But what matters is that we face it together, right? Maddie nodded slowly. Like when Mom was sick, and we made that big calendar to track all her medicines? Exactly like that. Dan's throat felt thick. We're problem solvers, you and me. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, Maddie occasionally sharing random facts from her homework while Dan tried to focus on the moment instead of the uncertainty waiting at the plant. After clearing the dishes, Dan helped Maddie pack her backpack. She hugged him extra tight before heading out to catch the school bus, and he watched from the doorway until she climbed aboard. Back inside, Dan straightened his supervisor's badge in the hall mirror. The face looking back at him seemed older than yesterday, the lines around his eyes deeper. He thought about the hundreds of families depending on Riverview Plastics, good people who'd worked hard, played by the rules, and deserved better than having the rug pulled out from under them. The drive to work felt longer than usual. Dan's old pickup rumbled past familiar landmarks, the corner grocery where Mrs. Corder Chen always saved him day-old bread, the playground where Maddie had learned to swing, the church where Sarah's funeral had been held. This wasn't just a town to him, it was home. The plant's parking lot was already filling up as Dan pulled in. He noticed Tasha's sedan in its usual spot, pristine and professional, nothing like the vulnerable scene from last night. Walking toward the entrance, he heard the usual morning chatter of his co-workers, their voices echoing off the brick walls. Inside, the industrial fans hummed their constant rhythm, and the smell of machine oil and plastic pellets filled the air. Dan made his way past the production lines, nodding to familiar faces. Some looked confused when they saw papers being taped to the break room door, announcing a mandatory meeting. The break room slowly filled with workers from all shifts. Dan stood near the back, watching as people claimed their usual spots. The maintenance crew in their oil-stained coveralls clustered by the vending machines, the quality control team perched on table edges, line workers filling the metal folding chairs. At exactly 8:30, Tasha Brooks entered the room. She looked nothing like the woman from last night. Her suit was crisp, her posture perfect, her expression composed. She stepped up to the small podium that had been set up, adjusting the microphone with steady hands. The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. Everyone had heard rumors about plant closures happening across the country. Dan could see the fear in their eyes, the way some gripped their coffee cups too tightly or crossed their arms defensively. "Good morning," Tasha began, her voice clear and strong. "I'm here today to announce a new initiative at Riverview Plastics." A collective breath seemed to be held. "We're creating what we're calling the Second Chance Line," she continued. "This will be a pilot program, staffing a complete shift with workers who haven't always had fair opportunities in manufacturing. Our older employees, our veterans, our neighbors who've faced barriers to employment, and young people who've been overlooked." The room erupted in murmurs. Dan watched as workers turned to each other, some with hope lighting their faces, others with skepticism etched in their frowns. "Dan Whitaker will be leading this initiative as interim supervisor," Tasha announced, and heads turned toward him. Dan stood straighter, meeting their gazes steadily. The whispers grew louder. He heard fragments. "About time someone gave folks a real shot," mixed with "some kind of charity program?" and "wonder what corporate's really up to." Tasha continued explaining the details, training schedules, mentorship opportunities, production goals. But Dan was focused on the faces around him. He saw Jerome, a Vietnam vet who'd been stuck on third shift for years despite his expertise. Maria, who'd been passed over for promotion 3 times. Young Marcus, who'd made one mistake years ago and was still paying for it. The room hummed with a strange energy, part hope, part doubt, part possibility. Dan caught Tasha's eye for a brief moment, and in that look, they both knew. This was their shot, their chance to prove that doing right by people could also mean doing right by business. The basement of Riverbend Community Church hummed with nervous energy as folks gathered around folding tables draped in faded checkered cloths. The familiar scent of potato casseroles and sweet tea mingled with something less comfortable, uncertainty hanging thick in the air. Pastor Ruth stood at the front, Her silver hair caught in the glow of fluorescent lights. Her weathered hands gripped the worn podium, steady and sure despite the tension in the room. "Before we begin tonight's meeting," she said, her voice carrying to every corner, "let us bow our heads in prayer." The shuffling of feet quieted. Dan Whitaker bowed his head, feeling the rough wood of the chair beneath his palms. He could sense Tasha Brooks standing near the wall, her usual corporate polish softened by the humble surroundings. "Lord," Pastor Ruth began, "guide us as we gather here tonight. Help us see beyond our fears to the possibilities you place before us. Give us wisdom to recognize that every soul carries your light, no matter their past. Amen." A chorus of amens rippled through the crowd. Dan looked up to see worried faces all around him. These were his neighbors, people he'd known his whole life, now faced with something that challenged their comfortable ways. Pastor Ruth gestured to the sign-up sheets laid out on a table near the front. "Ms. Brooks has shared her vision for what she calls the second chance line. Now we need people willing to step forward, both those seeking work and those ready to train them." Tasha moved to stand beside the pastor, her professional suit jacket at odds with the church basement's cinder-block walls. "We're looking for veterans," she said, her voice clear but gentler than her usual boardroom tone. "Older workers who've been passed over. People who've paid their debt to society and deserve a fresh start." A murmur went through the crowd. Dan watched Mrs. Henderson, who'd been sewing seat covers for 20 years, shake her head and whisper to her neighbor. Tommy Richards, who'd lost his driver's license after a DUI, shifted uncomfortably in his metal chair. "I'll head up the pilot line," Dan said, standing. His voice came out stronger than he expected. "I've worked that floor for 15 years. I know what it takes to meet quality standards." A few heads nodded. Dan had earned respect over the years. As a worker, a widower raising his daughter right, a man who treated everyone fairly. But then Bill Mason's voice cut through the quiet. "All due respect, Dan, but how are we supposed to trust folks fresh out of prison with expensive equipment? Or meet deadlines with workers who ain't been in a factory for years?" More murmurs, some agreeing. Dan felt his face flush, but before he could respond, another voice spoke up. "I was a seamstress for 30 years before arthritis took my hands." Sarah Johnson stood slowly, her tiny frame straight with dignity. "Nobody would hire me after that. But I know quality. I can teach it." Pastor Ruth smiled warmly. "Thank you, Sarah. Who else feels called to share their skills?" Slowly, hesitantly, others began to rise. Jim Cooper, a Vietnam vet who'd worked maintenance since the 80s. Maria Gonzalez, who'd started as a temp and worked her way up to quality control. But there were still doubters. "This ain't charity work," someone called from the back. "This is business. We can't afford mistakes." "You're right," Tasha said, stepping forward. "This isn't charity. It's investment in human potential. Every person in this room has faced setbacks. Every one of us has needed a second chance." The room grew quiet. Dan watched faces soften as her words sank in. He remembered his own dark days after losing Claire, how the community had rallied around him and Maddie. More people began moving toward the sign-up tables. Veterans who'd struggled to find their place after service. Older workers who'd been passed over for promotion. A young man Dan recognized from his daughter's youth group. The boy's father was still serving time, but the son was determined to build a different life. The smell of cooling casseroles filled the air as people lingered, talking in small groups. Mrs. Patterson's famous green bean dish sat half-eaten as she earnestly discussed training ideas with Maria. Tom Wheeler, recently released from county jail, stood awkwardly by the coffee urn until Jim Cooper walked over and started chatting about mechanical aptitude tests. Dan moved between the groups, answering questions, noting who might work well together. He could feel the initial resistance giving way to something else. Not quite enthusiasm yet, but possibility. Near the dessert table, someone had set out Claire's old recipe for apple crumble. The sight of it caught Dan off guard. How many church suppers had she brightened with that dish? He touched the edge of the ceramic pan, remembering her belief that food could build bridges between people. Looking up, he caught Tasha's eye across the room. She stood by the sign-up sheets, watching the small groups of people talking, planning, beginning to believe. In the fluorescent glare of the church basement, surrounded by casserole dishes and coffee urns, she looked both less and more than the corporate CEO, just another person hoping to make things better. Their eyes met over the scattered remains of dinner, over the heads of their neighbors, deep in conversation. Something passed between them, recognition of how fragile this moment was, how much could go wrong, but also how much might go right. The warmth of hope flickered like a candle flame, delicate but alive. The sound of a metal spoon tapping against a glass cut through the chatter. "Time to wrap up, folks," Pastor Ruth called. "Don't forget to sign up before you head home. And remember, faith moves mountains, but it's our hands that do the climbing." The evening shadows stretched long across the factory parking lot as Dan made his way back into the building. Most workers had gone home, leaving behind only the hum of industrial coolers and the occasional echo of his footsteps against concrete floors. Through the glass walls of her office, he could see Tasha Brooks bent over stacks of papers, her desk lamp casting a warm glow in the dimness. She'd shed her usual blazer, and her shoulders looked smaller somehow, more human. Dan knocked softly on the door frame. "Ms. Brooks?" She glanced up, quickly straightening some papers. "Dan, come in, please. And it's Tasha, remember?" He stepped inside, noticing the coffee cups scattered across her desk and the reading glasses perched on top of her head. The office, usually pristine, had the scattered look of someone who'd been working for hours without a break. "I wanted to go over the training schedules for next week," Dan said, pulling out a folded paper from his back pocket. "Got some ideas about pairing up the veterans with the younger folks." Tasha nodded, clearing a space on her desk. "Show me." As they worked through the logistics, Dan couldn't help but notice how she wrote notes in the margins, neat, precise handwriting that reminded him of his wife, Sarah's. The thought came with a familiar ache, but these days it was softer, more bittersweet than sharp. "The medical insurance coverage starts day 1, Tasha said, circling something on the page. "I won't have anyone worried about basic care while they're trying to learn new skills." "That's generous," Dan said quietly. "Most places make you wait 90 days. Tasha's pen paused mid-stroke. She set it down carefully, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I believe in taking care of people, Dan. Especially when they're facing battles they shouldn't have to fight alone." Something in her tone made him look up. She was watching him intently, her dark eyes holding a weight of meaning he didn't understand. "Like your wife's battle," she said softly. "With the cancer." Dan felt his chest tighten. "How did you?" "The anonymous donation that covered her final treatments." Tasha's voice was gentle. "That was me." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Dan gripped the edge of her desk, memories flooding back, the relief when the hospital had called about an anonymous benefactor, the way Sarah's face had relaxed, knowing they wouldn't lose the house paying for her care, the burden lifted from Maddie's young shoulders. "But," his voice came out rough, "how did you even know?" "I make it my business to know my people, Dan. All of them. When I heard through HR about your situation." She shook her head. No one should have to choose between treating their spouse and feeding their child. Dan sat heavily in the chair across from her desk, his legs suddenly unsteady. "We never knew who to thank," he managed. "Sarah wanted to. She made me promise to find out somehow, to tell them. That's why I'm telling you now." Tasha's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Because I need you to understand why this second chance initiative matters so much to me. It's not just about profits or proving something to the board. It's about seeing people, really seeing them, and giving them the dignity they deserve." Dan stared at his hands, calloused from years of factory work. He thought of Sarah in those final weeks, peaceful despite everything, telling him to keep his heart open to whatever good might come. "Thank you," he said finally, the words feeling small against the magnitude of what she'd done. "I don't know how to—" "Don't thank me," Tasha cut in firmly. "Just help me make this work. Help me show them what's possible when we invest in people instead of writing them off." Dan nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. They returned to the scheduling plans, but everything felt different now, charged with deeper meaning. Later, walking home through the quiet streets, Dan held Sarah's memory close. The familiar grief was there, but something else too, a sense of purpose taking root, strengthening with each step. He'd been given a gift beyond measure when his family needed it most. Now it was his turn to help build something that could lift others up the same way. The stars were bright overhead, and he could almost hear Sarah's voice. "Love finds its way back around, Danny. It always does." His determined footsteps echoed against the sidewalk as he headed home, carrying that truth in his heart. Dawn painted the factory walls in pale golden light as Dan arrived early, thermos in hand. The massive production floor lay quiet, waiting for the day shift to begin. Only the soft whir of ventilation systems broke the silence. He found Tasha already there, studying the newly designated second chance line with intense focus. "Morning," Dan said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "Couldn't sleep either?" Tasha turned, offering a small smile. "Too much on my mind." She gestured at the machinery. "Making sure everything's ready for today." Dan set his thermos on a nearby work table and moved closer to inspect the line. The familiar smell of metal and lubricant filled his nostrils. "We've got good equipment here. It's never been about that." "No," Tasha agreed quietly. "It hasn't." She ran her hand along a smooth steel rail, lost in thought. Then she looked at him with an odd expression. "You know, being back in this town, it brings up old memories. You grew up around here?" "Until I left for college." She paused, wrapping her arms around herself. "Actually, there's something I've been wanting to tell you since I recognized your name." Dan leaned against the workbench, curious. The morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair. "Do you remember the county fair about, 35 years ago?" Tasha asked. "The summer they had that traveling Ferris wheel?" Dan's forehead wrinkled. "Vaguely." "I was 17 then? 16? She corrected. "I was 14. She took a deep breath. "There were these 3 boys. They'd been following me around the fairgrounds, making comments, calling me names." Understanding dawned slowly on Dan's face, but it was clear the memory was fuzzy. "They cornered me behind the cotton candy stand," Tasha continued. Her voice grew quieter. "I was scared. Then this tall white boy came around the corner and told them to back off, said if they wanted to prove how tough they were, they could try it with someone their own size." Dan's eyes widened slightly. "That was you?" Tasha nodded. "You stood there until they left. Didn't say anything else, just made sure I was okay and walked away. Probably forgot about it 5 minutes later." I honestly don't remember much about it," Dan admitted. "Just a vague feeling that something happened at the fair that year." "I never forgot," Tasha said simply. "It was the first time a white person had ever stood up for me like that. No big speech, no trying to be a hero, just doing the right thing because it needed doing." Dan shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise. "Any decent person would have done the same." "But they didn't," Tasha said. "You did." She straightened up, professional demeanor sliding back into place. "When I saw your employee file, saw your picture, I knew it was you. Same quiet strength." The morning light had grown stronger now, illuminating the factory floor in earnest. Dan could see dust motes dancing in the golden beams that streamed through the high windows. "Maybe that's why I trusted you that night in the parking lot," Tasha added. "Some part of me remembered that 16-year-old boy who didn't look away." Dan cleared his throat, emotion making it tight. "I'm glad I could help." Then and now. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of shared history settling between them like a bridge across decades. The distant sound of voices began to filter in as early workers arrived. Tasha checked her watch. "Almost time." Dan nodded, straightening up. "The new crew should be here soon. Pastor Ruth's bringing some of them in her van." "Are you ready for this?" Tasha asked, studying his face. "Are any of us?" Dan replied with a slight smile. "But we're going to try anyway." The industrial clock on the wall ticked steadily towards 6 a.m. They could hear more voices now, footsteps in the hallway, locker doors clanging shut in the distance. "Dan," Tasha said suddenly. "Thank you. Not just for then, but for now. For believing this can work." Before he could respond, the work siren cut through the air with its familiar wail. Through the windows, they could see people walking across the parking lot. Older workers with graying hair, young men and women of various backgrounds, a few wearing the unmistakable bearing of military veterans. The Second Chance line was about to begin its first day. The morning sun streamed through the factory windows, casting long shadows across the production floor. Dan watched as James, a former veteran in his 50s, struggled with the calibration settings on the injection molding machine. Sweat beaded on James's forehead as his hands trembled slightly. "Take your time," Dan said, keeping his voice steady and encouraging. "Remember what we covered yesterday about the pressure gauge?" James nodded, his weathered face tight with concentration. "Yeah, just. These dials are smaller than what I'm used to. Here's a trick." Dan stepped closer, pointing but not touching. "Think of it like adjusting rifle sights. Small, precise movements." The tension in James's shoulders eased slightly. He adjusted the dial with more confidence, and this time the reading fell exactly where it needed to be. "There you go." Dan smiled, patting him on the shoulder. "Perfect adjustment." Across the line, Sarah, a woman in her early 60s who'd been passed over for training countless times before, was showing Maria, a younger hire, how to check the finished parts for defects. Sarah's experienced eyes caught details others might miss. "See this edge here?" Sarah pointed. "When it's right, you can feel it's smooth as glass. Any roughness means we need to check the mold temperature." Dan nodded approvingly as he passed. The teaching and learning flowing both ways was exactly what they needed. Sure, they were running slower than the other lines, but their quality numbers were improving daily. Near the end of the line, Trevor, recently released from prison, was meticulously organizing finished parts for shipping. His system was actually more efficient than the old method, something he'd developed from his previous warehouse experience. "How are we doing on the shipping quota?" Dan asked. Trevor straightened up, still not quite used to being addressed directly by management. "We're about 85% to target, Mr. Whitaker. Better than yesterday." "Dan," he corrected gently. "And that's good progress. We'll get there." The day continued, with its share of small victories and setbacks. A batch had to be scrapped when someone forgot to check the temperature settings. But instead of the usual blame game, the team huddled together to review what went wrong and how to prevent it next time. By evening, Dan was tired but satisfied with their progress. He decided to grab dinner at May's Diner instead of cooking. Maddie was at a friend's house for a sleepover, and the thought of an empty kitchen didn't appeal to him. The bell chimed as he pushed open the diner's door. The familiar smell of coffee and grilled onions wrapped around him like an old blanket. May herself waved from behind the counter, already reaching for the coffee pot. "The usual, Dan?" she called out. "Please," he replied, sliding into his regular booth. The diner was fairly quiet for a Thursday evening, just a few regulars scattered around. Dan had just taken his first sip of coffee when he heard familiar voices from the booth behind him. "Did you see the numbers from the charity line today?" It was Mike Peterson's voice, dripping with sarcasm. Mike had been running the main production line for 5 years. "Yeah," another voice chuckled. Bob Warner, one of the senior operators. 85%? My crew hits that in their sleep." "Well, what do you expect when you're running a halfway house instead of a business?" Mike's voice grew louder, clearly not caring who heard. "Veterans with the shakes, old-timers who can barely see straight, ex-cons. Heard they had to scrap a whole batch today," Bob added. "But hey, at least everyone's feelings are protected, right?" Dan's hand tightened around his coffee cup. The bitter taste in his mouth had nothing to do with the coffee. "Give it another week," Mike continued. "And corporate will see what a joke this whole thing is. Can't run a factory on good intentions." Dan's jaw clenched. These were men he'd worked alongside for years. Men who'd come to his wife's funeral. Men who'd helped him move into his house. And here they were, tearing down people who just wanted a fair chance. May appeared with his burger, catching his expression. She gave him a sympathetic look and squeezed his shoulder gently before moving away. The conversation behind him continued, peppered with snide remarks and mocking laughter. Each word felt like a personal betrayal. Dan thought about James's proud smile when he'd mastered the calibration, about Sarah finally getting to share her years of knowledge, about Trevor's quiet determination to prove himself. His food sat untouched as the reality sank in. The battle wasn't just in some distant boardroom with faceless executives. It was right here, in his own community, with people he'd known for years. The prejudice and resistance ran deeper than he'd imagined, rooted in the very streets and diners where he'd spent his whole life. Dan's jaw clenched tighter as Mike launched into another round of mockery. The fight ahead would be harder than he'd thought, and some of it would be with his own neighbors. Tasha sat in her office, the morning light barely filtering through the Venetian blinds. Her coffee had gone cold, forgotten as she stared at her phone screen. The headline blazed across the local news website, "CEO's woke experiment threatens factory's future." Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the article. Anonymous sources painted her second chance line as a reckless social experiment that put profits at risk. They'd quoted a board member who claimed she was prioritizing social justice over shareholder value. The phone on her desk rang again, the fourth call from board members this morning. She let it go to voicemail, just like the others. Each message had grown progressively more hostile, thinly veiled threats about her position, wrapped in corporate speak about fiscal responsibility and stakeholder concerns. Tasha set her phone down and pressed her palms against her desk, trying to steady herself. Through her office window, she could see the factory floor where Dan was working with the Second Chance crew. They were making progress, slower than ideal, but real progress nonetheless. Her office door opened, and her assistant poked her head in. "Ms. Brooks, there's another board member on line 1. Take a message," Tasha said firmly. "I'm heading to the floor." Down on the production line, Dan was showing Maria, a former seamstress in her 60s, how to check the quality metrics on finished parts. He heard the whispers before he saw Tasha approaching snippets of conversation from the regular crew working nearby. "There goes the social worker," one muttered. "Bet she's never worked a real job in her life," another added, just loud enough to be heard. Dan straightened up, his jaw tightening. But before he could say anything, Maria spoke up, her voice clear and steady. "These old hands have worked plenty of real jobs," she said, holding up fingers marked by decades of labor. "And they're learning new tricks just fine, thank you very much." Tasha reached them just as Maria successfully completed her quality check. The older woman's face broke into a proud smile as the metrics came back within specification. "Perfect work, Maria," Tasha said warmly, though Dan could see the tension around her eyes. Throughout the day, the pressure mounted. Dan overheard more comments in the break room, whispered accusations about quotas and reverse discrimination. He watched Tasha field call after call in her office, her shoulders growing more rigid with each one. By Saturday, the story had spread through town. At the grocery store, Dan noticed people staring at him, conversations stopping when he walked past. Some nodded in support, but others turned away with obvious disapproval. Sunday morning arrived with a heavy gray sky threatening rain. Dan sat in his usual pew at First Methodist, Maddie beside him. The wooden bench creaked as Tasha slipped in next to them, looking tired but determined. Pastor Ruth stood at the pulpit, her silver hair catching the light from the stained glass windows. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked out over her congregation. "Today," she began, her voice strong and clear, "I want to talk about faith. Not the easy kind that makes us comfortable on Sunday mornings, but the hard kind that challenges us to live differently on Monday." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the faces before her. "I've heard the talk this week, the whispers about changes at the plant, about who deserves chances and who doesn't, about what's practical versus what's right." The church was silent now, every eye on Pastor Ruth as she continued. "In James 2:17, we read that faith without works is dead, but I'll take it a step further today. Faith without fair practice is frayed faith." Dan saw several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Pastor Ruth's voice grew stronger. "When we say we believe in redemption but deny second chances, our faith frays. When we pray for our community but reject our neighbors, our faith frays. When we speak of God's love but practice prejudice, our faith doesn't just fray, it falls apart completely." She removed her glasses, holding them in her weathered hands. "This morning, I challenge you to examine your faith. Is it whole, or is it fraying, at the edges where belief meets action?" From his seat, Dan could see heads nodding throughout the congregation. He glanced at Tasha, finding her sitting straight-backed, chin lifted. Their eyes met briefly, and they exchanged small but determined nods. Pastor Ruth's voice softened. The good news is that faith, like fabric, can be mended. But it takes work, careful, intentional work. It takes courage to weave together what prejudice and fear have torn apart. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Dan stood before the Second Chance Line workers early Monday morning. Their faces showed a mix of worry and determination after the weekend's negative press. Some shifted from foot to foot, while others gripped their coffee cups like lifelines. "All right, folks," Dan began, his voice steady despite his own concerns. "I know you've probably seen the news, but right here, right now, we focus on what we can control." He gestured to the production board behind him. "Today's goal is simple. 50 units with 0 defects. We'll take it slow and steady." Mrs. Jones stood near the front, her silver hair neatly pulled back in a bun, her weathered hands already wearing her work gloves. Next to her, Marcus, a 20-year-old new hire, couldn't seem to stop fidgeting with his safety glasses. "Remember," Dan continued, "quality over speed. We're building more than just products here, we're building trust. In ourselves and in each other." The line started up with its familiar hum. Dan watched as Mrs. Jones took her position at the quality check station, her movements precise from decades of experience. Marcus stationed himself next to her, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to match her rhythm. The morning progressed slowly. Marcus fumbled with several pieces, his frustration growing visible with each mistake. But Mrs. Jones never lost her patience. "Here, honey," she said softly, demonstrating the proper technique again. "See how I hold it? Like you're cradling a baby bird, gentle but secure." Marcus's forehead wrinkled in concentration as he tried to mirror her movements. "Like this? That's better," Mrs. Jones nodded, her eyes crinkling with encouragement. "Now, feel that slight catch when it clicks. That's what you're looking for every time." Dan observed from nearby, pretending to check his clipboard while actually watching their interaction. Mrs. Jones had been doing this work since before Marcus was born, and her experience showed in every careful movement. By mid-morning, the line had settled into a steady rhythm. The initial tension began to ease as workers found their footing. Even Marcus started to show improvement, his movements becoming more confident under Mrs. Jones's guidance. During the lunch break, Dan noticed Mrs. Jones sharing her homemade cookies with Marcus and 2 other young workers. They sat together, trading stories and gentle jokes. It was exactly the kind of connection he'd hoped would develop. The afternoon brought its own challenges. A batch of materials arrived slightly off-spec, requiring extra attention to detail. Dan watched as Mrs. Proplier Jones calmly adjusted her inspection process, showing others how to accommodate the variation without compromising quality. "Remember what I told you about the baby bird," she reminded Marcus when he started to rush. "Speed comes with time. Precision comes first." By day's end, the line had produced 43 units short of their 50-unit goal, but every single one passed inspection. Dan saw more than just numbers, though. He saw how Marcus's shoulders had relaxed, how Mrs. Jones had become a natural mentor to several workers, how people who might never have crossed paths were now working in harmony. That evening, long after everyone had gone home, Dan sat at his kitchen table with a notebook. Maddie had already gone to bed, and the house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. Under the warm glow of the table lamp, he began to write. Day 1 results. He paused, tapping his pen thoughtfully, then added, "Notes." Dan looked at his notes, feeling a small surge of pride. They hadn't hit their numerical target, but they'd achieved something possibly more important. The beginnings of real teamwork. Mrs. Jones and Marcus had shown him that when people were given the chance to learn and teach, amazing things could happen. The school bus wheezed to a stop outside Riverview Plastics, and Maddie Whitaker hopped down the steps with her bright yellow backpack bouncing. Her dad had arranged for her to interview workers for her Community Heroes project, though they both knew it was about more than just homework. She clutched her mom's old digital camera, the one they'd found in the attic last summer. The screen was scratched, but it still worked perfectly, Through the employee entrance, she waved at Miss Jenny at security, who already had a visitor badge waiting. "Your daddy said you'd be coming by." Jenny smiled, pinning the badge to Maddie's sweater. "Making us all famous, are you?" "Not famous," Maddie grinned, "just showing everyone how special they are." The factory floor hummed with activity as Maddie made her way to the break room, careful to stay within the yellow safety lines her father had taught her about. She set up her little interview station in the corner, 2 folding chairs, her notebook with carefully prepared questions, and the camera on its mini tripod. Mrs. Jones was her first interview. The elderly seamstress settled into the chair, smoothing her work apron with weathered hands. "Tell me about your very first job," Maddie asked, holding up her notebook like a professional reporter. Mrs. Jones's eyes crinkled with memory. "I was 14, working summers at my aunt's alterations shop. Back then, we didn't have fancy machines. Everything was done by hand." She demonstrated the delicate motion of hand stitching. "That's where I learned patience makes perfect." Maddie snapped a photo as Mrs. Jones demonstrated her sewing technique. "And what do you love most about working here?" "Teaching others what I know," Mrs. Jones replied without hesitation. "Like young Marcus over there, he's got golden hands, just needed someone to believe in him." Throughout the afternoon, workers stopped by between shifts. James, a veteran with a quiet voice, shared stories about maintaining helicopters before joining Riverview. Maria, who'd started just last month, spoke about her dreams of becoming a line supervisor someday. Each person's eyes lit up when talking about their hopes and skills. Maddie noticed how they sat taller when she asked about their expertise. Some who seemed shy at first couldn't stop talking once they got going. She captured their gestures, their proud smiles, the way their hands moved when describing their work. By early evening, she'd spread her materials across a break room table. Construction paper in bright colors formed the backgrounds. She carefully printed each person's name and a quote from their interview under their photos. Her dad had bought her a special printer that could make pictures right away, and she arranged them artfully. "Need help hanging those up?" Dan appeared behind her, still in his work vest. "Yes, please." Maddie handed him the tape. Together, they transformed the break room walls into a gallery of faces and stories. Mrs. Jones's photo showed her demonstrating proper seam inspection, her quote reading, "Quality isn't just in the stitches, it's in the heart you put into every piece." James's serious expression softened as he explained equipment maintenance. "Treating machines with respect means they'll respect you back." Maria beamed next to her workstation. "At Riverview, I'm not just working, I'm building my future." Workers gathering for the shift change stopped to look. Conversations sparked as people pointed out their colleagues' photos and stories. Someone called out, "Hey, I didn't know you used to be a chef, Tony." Another chimed in, "Look at young Mrs. Jones, still got the same smile." The mood in the break room shifted. Backs straightened, chins lifted, pride radiated from faces as workers saw themselves through Maddie's lens, not just as employees, but as people with rich histories and valuable skills. Tasha Brooks stepped in, pausing to study each poster. She turned to Maddie with warm eyes. "You've captured something very special here. You've shown us who we really are." Dan watched his daughter chatting with workers about their stories, her face glowing with purpose. She'd inherited her mother's gift for seeing the best in people, for making them feel valued. Later that night, back home, Dan tucked Maddie into bed. Her room glowed softly under her star-shaped nightlight, the walls covered with her own photos and artwork. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said softly, smoothing her blanket. "What you did today, it meant a lot to everyone." Maddie snuggled deeper into her pillow, tired but happy. "We can do this, Daddy," she whispered. The evening sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Dan led a small group from the Second Chance line toward Joey's Diner. It had been a good day at the plant, their best numbers yet, and he'd suggested they celebrate with some of Joey's famous meatloaf. Marcus Johnson, one of the new hires, walked beside Dan with pride in his step. At 58, Marcus had struggled to find work after being laid off from his previous factory job. But on the Second Chance line, his decades of experience were finally being put to good use. Behind them came Mrs. Jones, the elderly seamstress who'd proven to be their best trainer, and Roberto Martinez, a young veteran who'd recently returned from overseas. They made quite a picture, different ages, backgrounds, and skin colors all walking together, trading jokes about the day's minor mishaps. The bell chimed as they entered Joey's. The familiar aroma of coffee and fried onions filled the air. A few regular customers looked up from their plates, their expressions shifting from casual interest to something less welcoming. "Evening, Martha," Dan called to the waitress, who smiled and gestured toward an empty booth. They settled in, Marcus and Roberto on one side, Dan and Mrs. Jones on the other. Martha brought over menus. They didn't need everyone knew Joey's offerings by heart. "The meatloaf special for me," Dan said, and the others quickly added their orders. The diner hummed with typical dinner rush sounds, clinking silverware, coffee being poured, the sizzle of the grill. Dan listened as Marcus described his grandson's recent baseball game, complete with animated gestures showing the winning pitch. From 3 booths over, a loud voice cut through their conversation. "Never thought I'd see the day Riverview started hiring." The word that followed made Dan's coffee cup freeze halfway to his lips. The slur hung in the air like smoke, aimed directly at Marcus. The diner went quiet. Marcus stared down at his hands, his shoulders tense. Mrs. Jones pressed her lips together, her face a mask of dignity. Roberto's jaw clenched. Dan set his cup down carefully. He'd known Bill Morrison for 20 years, their kids had played Little League together. But at this moment, that history meant nothing. "Martha," Dan called, his voice steady. "Check, please. But your food hasn't even—" Martha started. "That's all right." Dan stood up, pulling out his wallet. "We'll take care of it now." Mrs. Jones began gathering her purse, her hands trembling slightly. Marcus and Roberto rose too, their movements deliberate and controlled. Bill's voice came again, louder. "What's wrong, Whitaker? Can't take a joke?" Dan walked to the counter and placed enough cash to cover their meals, plus a generous tip. He turned to face Bill, speaking clearly so everyone could hear. "That wasn't a joke, Bill. That was hate, and we don't have to sit here and pretend it's okay." He turned to his crew. "Let's go, folks. There are plenty of other places that'll welcome good people's business." They filed out of the diner, heads held high. Through the window, Dan could see other diners watching, some looking uncomfortable, others thoughtful. Martha stood by Bill's table, coffee pot forgotten in her hand, shaking her head. Outside, the evening air felt cleaner somehow. Marcus cleared his throat. "Boss, you didn't have to—" "Yes, I did," Dan said simply. "We're a team now. That means we stand together." Mrs. Jones patted Dan's arm. "My grandmother used to say dignity isn't about fighting back, it's about knowing when to walk away." They ended up at the small pizza place, 3 blocks down, where the owner, Tony, welcomed them with genuine warmth. As they shared a large pepperoni and talked about tomorrow's production goals, Dan noticed his phone buzzing with text messages. Word was already spreading through town. Pastor Ruth. "Proud of you, Dan. Tasha. Thank you for showing what leadership really means." Even Joey himself. "Bill Morrison's been banned. Your crew eats free next time." But the message that meant the most came from Marcus's wife later that evening. "Thank you for giving my husband his dignity today." Dan read it twice, then tucked his phone away. He hadn't done anything special, he thought. He'd just done what was right, and maybe that was the whole point of the second chance line, doing what was right, one small moment at a time. The afternoon light filtered through the factory windows, casting long shadows across the production floor. Dan stood by the second chance line, watching as Mrs. Jones guided a returning citizen named Marcus through a complex calibration sequence. Her weathered hands moved with practiced ease, showing him exactly where to adjust the settings. "That's it," she encouraged, her voice gentle but firm. "Now check the readout one more time." Marcus nodded, his face etched with concentration. The machine whirred to life, and perfect parts began sliding down the conveyor belt. Dan checked his clipboard, allowing himself a small smile. The numbers were adding up. Across the floor, Tasha emerged from her office, tablet in hand. She'd been spending more time on the production floor lately, though the stress of the past few days had left dark circles under her eyes. Dan watched as she studied the day's metrics, her expression shifting from focused to surprised. "Dan," she called out, walking briskly toward him. "Are these numbers correct?" He nodded, pride warming his chest. "Third shift just finished. We hit every target, quality, safety, and timing." The tension in Tasha's shoulders eased slightly. For the first time in days, a genuine smile lit up her face. "Not just hit them," she said, turning the tablet so he could see. "We exceeded corporate's weekly metrics by 12%. Word spread quickly through the line. Marcus pumped his fist in the air, and Mrs. Jones dabbed at her eyes with her sleeve. Even the usually quiet veterans at the end of the line were grinning and clapping each other on the back. "I knew we could do it," said Sarah, a middle-aged woman who'd been passed over for promotion 3 times before joining the second chance line. "All we needed was a real shot." Dan gathered everyone around for the end-of-shift meeting. The usual tiredness was there, but it was different now. The good kind of tired that comes from honest work and achievement. They stood in a loose circle, some still wearing their safety glasses, others already reaching for their car keys. "Today," Dan began, his voice carrying across the group, "you proved something, not just to corporate, not just to the doubters, but to yourselves." He looked at each face in turn. "This is what happens when people get a fair chance and support each other." Tasha stepped forward, and the group fell respectfully quiet. She rarely addressed them directly, but today was different. "I've seen a lot of production lines in my career," she said, her voice steady but touched with emotion. "But what you've built here, it's not just about numbers. It's about dignity, about community." After the shift ended, Dan found Tasha still on the floor, running her hand along one of the machines. The pride in her eyes reminded him of something he hadn't seen in a long time: hope. "Meet me at River Point tomorrow at sunrise," she said suddenly. "There's something I need to tell you." The next morning, Dan arrived at the riverbank just as the first rays of sun painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges. The water flowed quietly beside him, and a light mist hung over the surface. Tasha was already there, sitting on one of the old wooden benches, wrapped in a light jacket against the morning chill. He settled beside her, offering a thermos of coffee, just like that first night in the parking lot. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun climb higher. "I'm terrified of failing them," Dan admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just the workers, but Maddie too, since Sarah passed." He trailed off, taking a deep breath. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm strong enough to carry all this." Tasha nodded slowly, wrapping her hands around the warm thermos. "You know what scares me?" she said, not meeting his eyes. "Being the first and only. First black woman CEO in the company's history. Only one in the room who has to prove herself 10 times over." She paused, watching a bird skim across the water. "Sometimes I feel so alone up there." Dan turned to look at her, seeing not the powerful CEO but someone who, like him, carried heavy burdens. "You're not alone," he said firmly. "Not anymore." She met his gaze, and something passed between them, understanding, maybe, or recognition of a shared battle. "Neither are you, Dan," she replied. "We don't go back alone. Not ever." The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. Below them, the river kept flowing, steady and sure, like the promise they'd just made to each other. The morning sun hadn't yet touched the factory windows when Dan arrived for his shift. Something felt off the moment he stepped through the doors. Martha from Quality Control rushed toward him, her face tight with worry. "Dan, the Henderson order. It's gone missing," she said, wringing her hands. "The whole batch we prepped yesterday. 6 pallets just vanished." Dan's stomach dropped. The Henderson order was their biggest rush delivery this month, due out in less than 3 hours. He strode quickly to the shipping area, his work boots echoing against the concrete floor. Sure enough, the staging area where they'd carefully arranged the pallets last night stood empty. "Show me the shipping log," he said, keeping his voice steady despite the growing knot in his chest. Martha flipped through her clipboard. "That's another thing. The system shows it was rerouted to Building C last night at 11:47 p.m. But Building C's been closed for renovations all week." Dan pulled out his phone and dialed Tasha's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the early hour. "I'm already on my way," she said before he could explain. "Just got the alert." Within minutes, the factory hummed with nervous energy as workers searched every corner of the facility. Dan organized search teams, trying to keep everyone focused and calm. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a simple mix-up. Tasha arrived wearing a charcoal suit, her heels clicking purposefully across the floor. Her expression remained professional, but Dan caught the worry in her eyes. "Any sign?" she asked quietly. Dan shook his head. "System says Building C, but we've checked twice. Nothing." They gathered in the conference room with the shift supervisors. As they reviewed security footage, Ralph from IT pointed out something strange. "Look here," he said, freezing the frame. "The system login that authorized the transfer, it's using Miss Brooks's credentials." The room fell silent. Dan watched Tasha's face carefully as she leaned forward to study the screen. "That's impossible," she said firmly. "I was home all evening. Check the timestamp. 11:47 p.m. I was on a video call with the Tokyo office until midnight." Before anyone could respond, Martha burst into the room, clutching another clipboard. "The quality control log for the Henderson order. It's missing too. The physical copy and the digital backup." Dan felt the tension in the room spike. 2 critical documents gone missing, both connected to their most important order, both somehow linked to Tasha's access credentials. Throughout the morning, whispers spread across the factory floor. Dan caught fragments of conversations that made his jaw clench. "Always seemed too good to be true." And maybe the board was right about her. By afternoon, they'd managed to rush a replacement order through production, thanks to the entire Second Chance line volunteering to work through lunch. But the damage was done. Dan overheard one of the old guard supervisors on the phone with someone, his voice low but clear. "Yeah. Looks like proof of what we suspected all along." The day dragged on endlessly. Every time Dan passed Tasha's office, he saw her on the phone, her posture rigid, defending herself to what seemed like an endless stream of board members and corporate officials. At 7 p.m., long after most workers had gone home, Dan found her still at her desk. The polished CEO facade had cracked. Her jacket was draped over a chair, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "They think I did it," she said without looking up. "The board's already talking about a formal investigation." Dan closed the office door and sat down across from her. "We both know you didn't." "Do we?" She laughed bitterly, gesturing at a pile of printed emails. "Anonymous tip line's been busy today. Apparently, I've been falsifying numbers, playing favorites, pushing a personal agenda this whole time." She picked up one page and read aloud. "Ms. Brooks clearly orchestrated this disaster to justify her social experiment." "That's ridiculous," Dan said firmly. "Everyone can see how the Second Chance line is improving. The numbers don't lie." "Numbers can be manipulated," Tasha said quietly. "That's what they're saying now, that I've been cooking the books to make the pilot program look better than it is." She pressed her fingers to her temples. "Maybe I was naive, thinking we could really change things." Dan leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "Look at me, Tasha." She raised her eyes to meet his. "I've known you were that anonymous donor for my wife's medical bills for weeks now. You never once mentioned it, never asked for anything in return. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Tasha's eyes glistened in the dim office light. "Someone's trying to sabotage everything we've built," Dan continued, "but I'm standing with you. The whole Second Chance line is standing with you. We're not backing down from the truth." A tear slipped down Tasha's cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. "The board meets tomorrow morning. They're talking about suspending me pending investigation." "Then we'll fight it," Dan said simply. "Together. Like you told me by the river, we don't go back alone." For the first time that day, Tasha's shoulders straightened slightly. She took a deep breath, and Dan saw a flicker of her usual determination return to her eyes. The factory hummed with nervous energy that Friday morning. Workers adjusted their uniforms and double-checked their stations for the 100th time. Dan walked the line, offering quiet words of encouragement to each person. "Remember, folks, just like we practiced," he said, patting shoulders and meeting eyes. "We know what we can do. The second chance line gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Every tool sat precisely in place, every gauge calibrated to perfection. Mrs. Aritu moaned. Jones, the elderly seamstress turned quality specialist, straightened her already straight workstation with trembling hands. "You've got this, Eleanor," Dan assured her. "Nobody has a better eye than you." She managed a tight smile. "These old hands better not fail me now." At exactly 9 a.m., the glass doors swung open. Tasha led a group of 5 board members onto the factory floor, their expensive suits and leather briefcases out of place among the machinery. Dan recognized Harrison Wells, the most vocal critic of their initiative, his stern face set in barely concealed disdain. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tasha addressed them with professional calm, though Dan caught the slight tremor in her voice. "Welcome to the Second Chance Line demonstration." The workers stood at attention as the board members approached. Dan noticed Marcus, a formerly incarcerated father of 3, straightening his spine with dignity. Beside him, Sarah Chen, an overlooked older worker who'd finally gotten her chance at advancement, held her head high. "We'll be running a full production cycle," Tasha explained, demonstrating every quality checkpoint and safety protocol. Harrison Wells checked his Rolex. "Let's see if this experiment of yours was worth delaying the inevitable, Ms. Brooks." Dan gave the signal. "Second chance line. Begin production run." The machinery whirred to life. Each worker moved with practiced precision, their movements fluid and confident. Mrs. Pruseson, Jones inspected pieces with laser focus, her experienced hands finding imperfections that even the machines missed. Marcus operated the calibration station like a symphony conductor, adjusting settings with delicate accuracy. Sarah managed inventory flow with seamless efficiency, keeping the line perfectly balanced. The board members watched, taking notes and whispering among themselves. Wells frowned at his clipboard, marking things off with sharp strokes of his pen. 30 minutes in, they hit their first milestone. "Quality check station reporting 0 defects," Mrs. Jones announced clearly. One of the board members raised her eyebrows, impressed. The production continued smoothly, each station reporting perfect metrics. "Safety protocols all green," called out Jim, a veteran who'd struggled to find work before the initiative. "0 incidents. 0 close calls." Another board member nodded approvingly. Even Wells looked less certain of his criticism. The morning wore on. The line maintained its impeccable performance. Dan moved between stations, but his people barely needed him. They had this. They knew it. At the 2-hour mark, Sarah announced the final numbers. Production rate 15% above target. Quality metrics at 99.8%. Safety compliance 100%. The data flashed on the overhead screens. Irrefutable evidence of excellence. A moment of silence fell over the factory floor. Then one of the board members started clapping. Others joined in. The applause grew, echoing off the high ceiling. Workers who had been holding their breath broke into grins. Mrs. Jones wiped happy tears from her eyes as Marcus hugged her. Sarah high-fived Jim. The line had become a family, and they'd just proved their worth to the world. Dan watched as Tasha handled the aftermath, answering questions and presenting additional data. The board members clustered around her, their body language now open and engaged. Even Wells had put away his skeptical frown. When the board finally headed toward the exits, workers began celebrating in earnest. Hugs and congratulations flowed freely. Marcus lifted Mrs. Jones right off her feet in a bear hug, making her laugh like a girl. Dan found himself grinning so hard his face hurt. He looked across the room and caught Tasha's eye. She made her way over to him through the celebrating crowd. "We did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. For that shining moment, they both believed it was enough. The numbers didn't lie. The proof was undeniable. Their people had shown exactly what they could do when given a fair chance. Dan watched the joy on the faces around him. Proud workers who had proved their worth. A community that had come together and exceeded every expectation. The second chance line had become something beautiful. Standing beside him, Tasha's smile held all the hope they'd worked so hard to build. The triumph of the afternoon felt like a distant dream when the alarm pierced the darkness at 11. 4:47 p.m. Its shrill wail echoed through the empty factory halls, startling the night security guard from his rounds. Dan's phone jolted him awake. He fumbled for it, heart pounding as he recognized the emergency alert tone. Maddie appeared in his doorway, frightened by the noise. "Stay here, sweetheart," he said, already pulling on his shoes. "I'll call as soon as I know what's happening." The drive to the plant took 7 minutes, the longest 7 minutes of his life. Red and blue lights painted the parking lot in harsh colors. 2 fire trucks were already on scene, their crews moving with practiced efficiency. Smoke billowed from the storage area behind the main production floor. The acrid smell of burning plastic stung Dan's nose as he rushed toward the gathering crowd of workers who lived nearby. "Everyone okay?" he asked, scanning faces in the dark. Mrs. Jones nodded, wrapped in a hastily grabbed sweater. "Security got the call just in time. Thank the Lord no one was hurt." Fire Chief Martinez approached, his face grim under his helmet. "Storage area's taken damage. Looks like it started near the raw materials section." Dan's stomach dropped. That's where they kept the high-grade polymers for the Second Chance line's precision work. The very materials that had helped them achieve today's perfect demonstration. Tasha arrived minutes later, her usual polished appearance replaced by simple jeans and a sweatshirt. Her eyes widened at the scene. "Initial assessment?" she asked, voice steady despite the chaos. "Contained to storage," Chief Martinez reported. "But there's water damage from the sprinklers, smoke damage throughout. Insurance investigators will need to clear everything before you can resume operations." Workers huddled in small groups, whispering. Dan caught fragments of worried conversations about paychecks and families to feed. He saw fear in their eyes, the same fear he'd noticed the night Tasha first confided in him about the closure threat. The firefighters worked methodically, ensuring every spark was extinguished. By 2 a.m., the immediate danger had passed, leaving behind soaked floors and the lingering smell of smoke. Dawn brought harsh reality. Insurance assessors in suits arrived early, taking photos and notes. Yellow caution tape blocked off the storage area. The Second Chance line stood silent, its morning shift canceled pending investigation. Dan found Tasha in her office, on the phone with corporate. Her face was drawn, shoulders tense. She held up one finger as he entered, then finished her call. "How bad?" he asked. "Insurance has suspended our coverage until they complete a full investigation," she said, rubbing her temples. "We can't operate without it. But we just proved yesterday—" "I know." Her voice cracked slightly. "I know." A knock interrupted them. A stern-faced man in a corporate security uniform stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 board representatives Dan recognized from yesterday's demonstration. "Ms. Brooks," the security officer said formally, "we need you to step away from your computer." "What?" Tasha's confusion shifted to shock as they explained. Quality control logs, the ones that had gone missing earlier, had been found in a hidden folder on her laptop. Modified. Dated stamps altered. "This is ridiculous," Dan protested. "She wouldn't—" "Mr. Whitaker, please leave," one of the board members ordered. "Ms. Brooks is suspended pending investigation into both the altered records and any potential connection to last night's incident." Tasha stood, dignified, even as security began to escort her out. "Dan," she said quietly, "tell them I'm sorry." He watched helplessly as they led her away. Within an hour, an all-employee email arrived. Due to the fire, insurance complications, and emerging evidence of procedural violations, the board had set final closure in 2 weeks. Workers gathered in the break room, shell-shocked. Mrs. Jones dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The formerly incarcerated father who'd mastered calibration stared at his hands, as if wondering if he'd ever get another chance. Dan thought of Tasha's tears that first night in the parking lot, of all they'd built since then. Now, watching hope drain from his people's faces, he felt the same helpless anger he'd experienced when his wife's cancer progressed. That feeling of something precious being stolen, and being powerless to stop it. The Second Chance line stood empty, its future disappearing like smoke in the morning air. The kitchen clock ticked past midnight, its steady rhythm the only sound in Dan Whitaker's dark house. He sat slumped at the kitchen table, his coffee long gone cold, his weathered hands pressed against his temples. The moonlight filtering through the window cast harsh shadows across the bills and notices scattered before him. 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks until the plant closed, for good. The thought of telling his crew tomorrow made his stomach turn. Good people who'd trusted him, worked hard, proved themselves, all of it, about to crumble. The memory of Tasha being escorted out, her head held high even as security walked her to her car, haunted him. The evidence they'd found on her laptop was obviously planted, but the board had what they wanted, an excuse to push her out and shut everything down. A floorboard creaked, and Dan looked up to find Maddie standing in the doorway in her pajamas, her long hair mussed from sleep. She clicked on the small lamp above the sink, bathing the kitchen in a soft glow. "Dad," her voice was quiet but steady. "I heard you down here. Sorry, sweetie, did I wake you?" Dan tried to straighten up to put on a brave face for his daughter. But Maddie wasn't fooled. She pulled out a chair and sat next to him, her eyes taking in the scattered papers and his defeated posture. "Is it about the fire? About Ms. Brooks being suspended?" Dan nodded slowly. "The plant's closing in 2 weeks. For good this time." His voice cracked slightly. "All those people. But that's not fair." Maddie's hands balled into fists on the table. "Everyone was doing so well. My posters showed how hard they were working. Sometimes life isn't fair, honey." Dan reached over to squeeze her hand. "Remember what you told Mrs. Jones's grandson when he wanted to quit after messing up that first day?" Maddie's chin lifted stubbornly. "You told him people can change if they're given a chance. You said we have to be brave enough to try again." Dan stared at his daughter, seeing so much of her mother's fire in those determined eyes. "You told us people can change," Maddie continued softly. "Don't you quit first." The simple wisdom of her words hit Dan like a physical force. He'd been sitting here wallowing in defeat, while his 12-year-old daughter showed more courage than he did. "When did you get so smart?" he asked, managing a small smile. "Mom always said I got it from both of you." Maddie smiled back, but her expression remained serious. "What are we going to do?" Dan sat up straighter, his mind beginning to work again. "First thing, we need help. People who know the truth about Ms. Brooks, about what we were achieving." "Like Pastor Ruth?" Maddie suggested. "She always says the church is supposed to stand up for what's right." Dan checked the time, nearly 1 a.m. But he knew Pastor Ruth kept late hours, often working on her sermons long into the night, and this couldn't wait until morning. He picked up his phone, scrolling to her number. Maddie watched him expectantly as it rang. "Dan?" Pastor Ruth's voice was alert despite the hour. "Is everything all right?" "No, Pastor, it's not." Dan took a deep breath. "But maybe with your help it could be. The plant closure, Ms. Brooks's suspension, none of it's right. And I think it's time we did something about it." There was a pause. Then Pastor Ruth's voice came back strong and clear. "Meet me at the church in 30 minutes. I'll put on some coffee. We have work to do." Dan hung up and looked at Maddie. "Want to help me wake up some people who need to hear the truth?" She was already running for her shoes. "I'll get my camera." Within minutes they were in Dan's truck, heading through the quiet streets of Riverbend. Dan's phone buzzed with responses to his urgent text messages. Mrs. Jones was in, and she'd call the quilting circle. The veterans group leader would round up his members. Even the diner owner, who'd witnessed Dan's walkout days ago, offered his place for an early morning meeting spot. The church windows glowed warmly as they pulled into the parking lot. Pastor Ruth stood in the doorway, her silver hair gleaming in the porch light. Despite the hour, she looked ready for battle, her Bible tucked under one arm and a determined set to her jaw. "The youth group is spreading the word on social media," she said as they hurried inside. "And I've called every deacon on the board. People are angry about what's happening, Dan. They just needed someone to take the first step." In the church basement, Pastor Ruth pulled out a large whiteboard while Maddie set up her camera. Dan began writing down names, connections, and resources, building a web of community support that grew larger by the minute as more text messages arrived. "We'll need proof about that falsified evidence on Miss Brooks's laptop," Pastor Ruth mused, scanning their growing list of allies. "Tommy's nephew is great with computers," Maddie piped up. "He helped set up the church's new website." Dan nodded. "And we'll need witnesses about the quality improvements, the real numbers before they disappeared. The quilting circle knows everyone's business. Pastor Ruth smiled. If there was tampering, someone saw something. They worked through the night, plotting and planning, the basement filling with purpose and hope. By the time the sky began to lighten outside the high windows, they had the beginnings of a real community rally taking shape. Dan looked at their work, the lists of supporters, the action items, the timeline they'd mapped out. It wouldn't be easy, but they weren't giving up. Not when they'd come so far. "You were right, Maddie," he said softly, pulling his daughter close. "People can change. And sometimes they just need someone to remind them how." Pastor Ruth clasped her hands together. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, but He never fails to send us what we need. Sometimes it's the faith of a child that lights the way forward." The fluorescent lights hummed in the church basement as Pastor Ruth moved between folding tables, her silver hair catching the harsh glare. The space normally reserved for potlucks and Bible study had transformed into a makeshift command center. Handwritten schedules covered the walls, and the smell of coffee mingled with the musty basement air. "We need eyes on every shift," Dan said, standing at the front table with a clipboard. "Morning, afternoon, and night. Document everything." Mrs. Jones from the quilting circle adjusted her reading glasses as she studied the sign-up sheet. "I can take mornings. These old bones still wake up at 5 anyway." She wrote her name in neat cursive, then passed the clipboard to Bill Thompson, a Vietnam veteran who'd worked the second chance line. "Got the afternoon covered," Bill said, his weathered hands steady as he added his name. "Plenty of us vets willing to stand watch." The basement door creaked open, and 16-year-old Tommy Chen shuffled in, lugging a laptop bag. His black-rimmed glasses slipped down his nose as he made his way to a corner table. "Sorry I'm late, Mr. Whitaker. Had to grab some equipment from home." Dan walked over to Tommy's table, watching the teen set up his computer. "You sure you can handle this, Tommy? We're not asking you to do anything illegal." Tommy's fingers flew across the keyboard as he spoke. "The factory's security cameras are on a closed network, but they back up to cloud storage. If someone messed with the original footage, the cloud copies might show it." He looked up at Dan. "My mom's on the line. I want to help." More volunteers filtered in. Jenny from the youth group brought homemade cookies. 3 retired teachers formed a note-taking team. The basement buzzed with purpose as people claimed their roles. "Remember," Pastor Ruth called out, "we're seeking truth, not revenge. Let's pray before we start." The room fell silent as heads bowed. After the prayer, Tommy waved Dan over. "Mr. Whitaker, I found something weird in the access logs." His screen showed columns of timestamps and ID numbers. "See these login patterns? Someone's been accessing the system at odd hours." Dan pulled up a chair, studying the data. "Can you tell who?" "Working on it." Tommy's face glowed blue in the screen light. "Each badge has a unique code, but—" He stopped, squinting at something. "Wait, look at this." The teen pulled up another window, showing grainy security footage. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m., 3 days before the fire. The hallway leading to the server room appeared empty at first. "Watch the bottom corner," Tommy said, pointing. A shadow moved across the frame. The figure stepped partially into view, someone in a supervisor's jacket. "Can you clean this up?" Dan leaned closer. Tommy tapped more keys, adjusting the contrast. The image sharpened slightly. "There's better footage from the other angle. Let me sync the timestamps." A second video feed appeared. The figure's face became clear as they glanced around before entering the server room. Dan's stomach tightened. Chuck Dorsey. The room had gone quiet, other volunteers gathering around Tommy's screen. They watched Chuck disappear into the server room, emerging 8 minutes later. "The quality log disappeared the next day," Mrs. Jones whispered. "And that rush order got lost in the system." Bill Thompson crossed his arms. "Chuck's been at Riverview 25 years. Why would he—" "Because he was promised something," Dan said, his voice heavy. "Question is, by whom?" Tommy raised his hand slightly. There's more footage, from other nights, too." Pastor Ruth touched Dan's shoulder. "Document everything carefully. We'll need it for the town hall." Dan nodded, his mind racing. Chuck had always been defensive about the second chance line, making snide comments in meetings. But sabotage? That meant someone higher up had gotten to him, offered him something worth betraying his coworkers for. The volunteers worked late into the night. Tommy downloaded and archived the footage, while others logged times and dates. The retired teachers cross-referenced every incident of system errors with Chuck's badge activity. Around midnight, Pastor Ruth started sending people home in shifts. "Get some rest," she told Dan. "Tomorrow we prepare for the town hall." Dan gathered his notes, his heart heavy with Chuck's betrayal, but lifted by the sight of his neighbors working together. The truth was coming to light, one piece at a time. Tommy saved the last files to a secure drive. "All backed up, Mr. Whitaker. Nobody can delete this evidence now." "Good work, Tommy." Dan helped the teen pack up his equipment. "Your mom would be proud." The basement emptied slowly, volunteers drifting out into the cool night air. Mrs. Jones patted Dan's arm as she left. "We'll set this right," she said. "Truth has a way of rising." Dan was one of the last to leave, helping Pastor Ruth stack chairs. The evidence they'd found felt like both a weight and a weapon. Chuck's face on that security footage kept replaying in his mind. A man he'd worked with for years, choosing to destroy rather than adapt. But they had proof now. Proof of sabotage, proof of what they'd suspected all along. The town hall meeting loomed ahead, a chance to expose the truth and save not just jobs, but the soul of their community. As Dan clicked off the basement lights, Pastor Ruth's words echoed in his thoughts. They were seeking truth, not revenge. The distinction would matter in the days ahead. Dan's truck rolled to a stop in front of Chuck Dorsey's modest ranch house on Maple Street. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawn, and a garden gnome stood sentry by the front steps. Dan sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he gathered his courage. He'd known Chuck for 15 years. They'd shared countless shifts, company picnics, and morning coffees. Now, with the security footage showing Chuck near the server room on that crucial night, Dan felt a mix of anger and sadness churning in his gut. Taking a deep breath, he climbed out of his truck and walked up the concrete path. Before he could knock, the screen door creaked open. Chuck stood there, still in his work boots and factory jacket, his face tight with wariness. "Figured you'd show up sooner or later," Chuck said, crossing his arms. "Can we talk, Chuck?" Dan kept his voice level, neighborly. Chuck's jaw worked back and forth. "Nothing to talk about. We both know that's not true." Dan gestured to the pair of wooden chairs on the front porch. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." After a long pause, Chuck stepped aside. Instead of the porch chairs, he led Dan into his kitchen. Family photos lined the walls. Chuck with his kids at graduations, fishing trips, birthdays. A life built on factory paychecks, just like Dan's. They sat at the kitchen table, a bowl of fruit between them. The clock above the stove ticked loudly in the silence. "We saw the footage, Chuck," Dan said quietly. "Tuesday night, 11:47 p.m. You by the server room." Chuck's face flushed. "So what? I work there. I can walk wherever I want. The missing order? The quality log that showed up on Tasha's computer? The fire?" Dan leaned forward. "Come on, Chuck. You're better than this." "Better than what?" Chuck's voice rose. "Better than watching some diversity program take over? Better than seeing my 30 years mean nothing? Is that what Kane told you?" Dan watched Chuck's expression flicker at the board member's name. "What did he promise you, Chuck?" Chuck stood abruptly, pacing the linoleum floor. "You don't understand. Kane said once the plant closes, they're opening a new facility. Smaller, more efficient." His words tumbled out faster. "He said I could be operations manager. Finally get out of supervisor, pay grade. And all you had to do was help sink the second chance line." Chuck's shoulders slumped. He dropped heavily back into his chair, suddenly looking older. "It wasn't supposed to hurt anyone. Just mess up some numbers. Make the experiment look bad." His voice cracked. "I didn't know about the fire. Kane's guy did that. I swear, Dan, I didn't know they'd go that far." Dan thought of all the faces on his line. Mrs. Jones teaching the young workers, veterans finding their footing, people rebuilding their lives. All of them counting on this chance. Those people you helped hurt? Dan said softly. They're our neighbors, Chuck. Their kids play with your grandkids. They shop at the same stores, pray in the same churches. Chuck pressed his palms against his eyes. I know, God help me, I know. When he looked up, there were tears on his weathered cheeks. I got scared, Dan. 30 years in one place, and what do I have to show for it? Kane made it sound so simple. It's not too late to make it right. Chuck gave a bitter laugh. How? I helped sabotage the plant. I betrayed everyone. Tell the truth at the town hall meeting, Dan said. Help us expose what Kane did. They'll fire me. Might even press charges. Maybe. Dan nodded. But you'll be able to look your grandkids in the eye. Tell them you stood up for what's right, even when it was hard. Silence filled the kitchen again. Chuck stood and walked to the window over his sink. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. My dad worked that line for 40 years, Chuck said quietly. Used to tell me, son, a man's reputation is worth more than money. Guess I forgot that somewhere along the way. He turned back to Dan, his face etched with resolve despite his fear. I'll do it. I'll testify about everything. Kane's promises, the sabotage, all of it. Dan stood and extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Chuck shook it. Thank you, Dan said simply. Don't thank me, Chuck replied, his voice rough with emotion. Just help me find a way to make things right with everyone I hurt. As Dan walked back to his truck, he glanced over his shoulder. Chuck stood in his doorway, silhouetted against the warm light inside, looking both smaller and somehow more human than he had in years. The community center's old wooden floors creaked under the weight of hundreds of folding chairs, each one filled with someone whose life hung in the balance. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow on worried faces. Outside, through tall windows, the late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Dan stood at the edge of the makeshift stage, his hands slightly trembling as he adjusted his tie. He'd never spoken in front of so many people before. In the front row, Maddie gave him a thumbs up, her faith in him unwavering. Next to her, Pastor Ruth nodded encouragingly. Camera crews from local stations set up their equipment along the walls. Reporters' notepads flipped open. The air felt thick with tension and anticipation. Mayor Thompson approached the podium first, his voice echoing through the packed hall. Tonight, we gather to discuss the future of Riverview Plastics, a cornerstone of our community for over 50 years. He paused, scanning the crowd. We'll hear from several speakers, beginning with line supervisor Dan Whitaker. Dan walked to the podium, his work boots making hollow sounds against the wooden platform. He pulled out his notes, then looked at them for a long moment before tucking them back into his pocket. His heart pounded, but when he spoke, his voice came out steady and clear. I've worked at Riverview for 23 years, he began. Started on third shift, just like my father did. This isn't just about jobs, it's about dignity. He gripped the sides of the podium. Every morning, I see people walk through those factory doors with purpose. Veterans who served our country, grandmothers who've worked the lines longer than I've been alive, young folks getting their first real chance, people who made mistakes and are working hard to make things right. The room stayed silent, hanging on his words. In the middle section, Mrs. Jones, the elderly seamstress, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The second chance line proved something important, Dan continued. When people are given a fair shot, when we look past prejudices and old ways of thinking, we don't just meet standards, we exceed them. That's not charity. That's not a woke experiment. That's human dignity, meeting opportunity. Scattered applause broke out, growing stronger. Dan stepped back, and Tasha Brooks rose from her chair. Her suspension had been lifted just hours before, after the security footage emerged. She walked to the podium with the same grace she'd shown that first night in the parking lot, though now there was steel in her spine. Good evening, she began, her voice warm but firm. Some of you know me as the CEO who stirred up trouble. Others know me as the woman who dared to suggest that talent and determination don't belong to just one group of people. She paused, letting that sink in. What most of you don't know is my story. My father was a janitor, at a factory much like Riverview. Every night he cleaned floors and emptied trash while dreaming of something better for his children. My mother worked as a seamstress, taking in extra work to help pay for my books. The room grew still. Even the reporters stopped scratching in their notepads. I won a scholarship to college, graduated top of my class. But in my first corporate job, I was mistaken for the coffee girl 3 times in 1 week. A few knowing chuckles rippled through the crowd. I worked twice as hard, stayed twice as long, and still heard whispers that I was only there to fill a quota. She straightened her shoulders. When I became CEO, I promised myself I'd create the workplace I wished I'd found, one where effort and character matter more than appearance or background. The second chance line wasn't just about saving jobs, it was about saving our belief in what's possible when we truly see each other. Murmurs of agreement floated through the hall. Several people stood, applauding. But before the moment could build, a voice called out from the back of the room. "I need to say something." Heads turned. Chuck Dorsey stood up slowly, his face ashen. The plant supervisor looked smaller somehow, his usual confidence replaced by visible shame. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I helped sabotage the second chance line." The room erupted in gasps and shocked whispers. Chuck raised his hands, pleading for silence. Board member Harold Kane promised me a promotion after the closure. Said I'd help manage the property development deal. Chuck's words tumbled out faster now, like a dam breaking. I changed the order routing system, planted that quality log on Ms. Brooks's laptop, he swallowed hard, even started that small fire in storage. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Shouts of anger, cries of disbelief. Phones came out, recording every word. Kane said nobody would get hurt, Chuck continued, his voice shaking. Said it was just business. But I saw what that line was doing, how people were growing, succeeding, and I couldn't live with myself anymore. More gasps filled the hall. Camera flashes sparked like lightning. In the front row, the other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Harold Kane's face had turned an alarming shade of red. Dan and Tasha exchanged glances across the stage, their months of struggle suddenly cast in a new light. The truth was finally coming out, and with it, the chance to save everything they'd built. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Riverview's executive boardroom, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table. Board members shifted uneasily in their high-backed leather chairs, the events of yesterday's explosive town hall still fresh in their minds. Harold Kane's chair sat conspicuously empty. Papers and laptops covered the table's surface as the remaining 11 board members exchanged tense glances. Some dabbed at their foreheads with handkerchiefs, while others drummed their fingers nervously on the table's smooth surface. Tasha Brooks stood at the head of the table, her posture straight and dignified despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes. She wore a crisp navy suit, her expression calm but determined as she faced the board members who had tried to force her out just days ago. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Yesterday's revelations about Mr. Kane's actions have brought us to a crossroads. We can either continue down the path of closure, or we can embrace an opportunity for transformation." Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Richard Morton, a silver-haired man in his 60s, cleared his throat. "Ms. Brooks, while Kane's behavior was inexcusable, the fundamental issues with Riverview's profitability remain." "Do they?" Tasha picked up a thick folder from the table. "The second chance line's metrics prove otherwise. When we invested in our people, all our people, they delivered excellence. The problem was never our workers' capabilities. It was our failure to recognize and nurture their potential." She began distributing documents to each board member. "What I'm proposing is bold, but it's also practical. Converting Riverview into an employee-owned ESOP pilot program would align everyone's interests, workers, management, and shareholders." Martha Chen, the youngest board member, studied the proposal with interest. "An employee stock ownership plan? That's quite a departure from traditional corporate structure." "It's also a proven model," Tasha countered, clicking through a presentation on the wall screen. "Companies with ESOP programs show higher productivity, lower turnover, and better profit margins. When workers have skin in the game, they innovate, they problem solve. They take pride in their work because they're building their own future. The boardroom erupted into heated discussion. Some members leaned forward, engaged and curious, while others shook their heads in skepticism. "The transition costs," began Douglas Weber, but Tasha was ready, "are offset by tax advantages and increased productivity. Look at page 12 of your packets. I've run the numbers extensively." She pointed to specific figures, her finger tracing along profit projections. "Within 3 years, we could see a 20% increase in efficiency." The morning light shifted as clouds passed outside, casting alternating patterns of light and shadow across the faces around the table. The air felt heavy with the weight of decision. James Patterson, the board's senior member, removed his reading glasses slowly. "Tasha, you've proven yourself more than capable in crisis. But this is unprecedented for our industry. Why should we take such a risk?" Tasha paused, letting the question hang in the air for a moment. "Because it's not just about business metrics anymore. Yesterday we saw the real cost of our old way of thinking. We saw how corruption breeds in systems that value profits over people." She walked to the window, looking out at the factory below where workers gathered in small groups, waiting for news of their fate. "But we also saw something else. We saw a community come together. We saw people from all walks of life stand up for each other. That's not just good ethics, it's good business." The board members followed her gaze, some standing to join her at the window. In the parking lot below, they could see Dan Whitaker talking with a group of workers, his daughter Maddie beside him. The sight seemed to humanize the decision before them. Martha Chen spoke up again. "I move. We put it to a vote." "Seconded," came Patterson's voice, surprising many around the table. The next few minutes passed in tense silence as paper ballots were distributed and marked. Tasha stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back, as the votes were collected and counted. Patterson, as senior member, cleared his throat to announce the results. The room held its breath. "The motion to convert Riverview Plastics to an employee-owned ESOP pilot program passes, 8 votes to 3. He turned to Tasha. "Furthermore, in light of recent events and your vindication, the board formally reinstates you as CEO with full authority to implement this transition." The tension in Tasha's shoulders released slightly, the only visible sign of her relief. She nodded graciously. "Thank you for your trust. We won't let you down." A light ripple of applause broke out around the table. Even some of those who had voted against the measure joined in, recognizing the historic nature of the moment. Martha Chen was the first to stand and shake Tasha's hand. "Congratulations, CEO Brooks. It seems Riverview is about to make history." One by one, the board members rose, gathering their materials and exchanging handshakes. The morning sun now filled the room completely, as if nature itself was celebrating the dawn of a new era at Riverview. The old Riverview factory buzzed with renewed energy as townspeople streamed through its gates, carrying paint buckets, cleaning supplies, and toolboxes. After decades of watching the building slowly fade, the community had come together to breathe fresh life into their cornerstone workplace. Dan Whitaker stood in the parking lot, clipboard in hand, directing volunteers to different areas. "Mrs. Jones, your quilting circle can set up in the cafeteria?" He called out to the elderly seamstress, who'd been one of the Second Chance Line's strongest supporters. She nodded, leading a group of women carrying fabric and sewing supplies toward the building. 12-year-old Maddie Whitaker darted between the groups, her camera steady in her hands as she captured every moment. "Dad, look!" she called out, pointing to where Pastor Ruth was organizing a painting crew. "The whole youth group came." Dan smiled, watching teenagers in old clothes carefully tape off windows and lay down drop cloths. Some of these kids' parents had worked at Riverview their whole lives. Now here they were, helping save it for the next generation. Inside, the transformation was already underway. The maintenance crew had removed the old, yellowed notices from bulletin boards, replacing them with fresh cork surfaces. Veterans from the local VFW post were pressure washing walls, while former line workers scrubbed decades of grime from equipment with loving care. "This place cleans up nice," said Joe Martinez, one of the Second Chance Line workers, as he helped replace burnt-out light bulbs in the main production area. The new LED fixtures cast a brighter, clearer light that made everything look fresher. In the cafeteria, Mrs. Jones and her quilting circle had taken over several tables. Their sewing machines hummed steadily as they worked on an enormous banner. Blue and gold fabric, the company colors, spread out before them as they carefully pieced together letters that would spell out Second Chance Line. "We're putting a little extra love in every stitch," Mrs. Jones told Maddie as the girl filmed their progress. "This banner isn't just cloth and thread, it's hope made visible." Maddie zoomed in on the careful handwork, her camera catching the subtle shimmer of golden thread. "Can you tell me why you volunteered to help?" she asked, slipping into her role as documentarian. Mrs. Jones looked up from her sewing, her eyes bright behind her glasses. "Because second chances aren't just for young folks, dear. This plant gave me my first job 40 years ago. Now it's giving me another chance to be useful, to teach what I know. That's worth fighting for." Outside, Dan helped unload paint from Tommy Chen's hardware store truck. The local business owner had donated dozens of gallons after hearing about the renovation effort. "My father worked here 30 years, Tommy said, handing Dan another can. "Never thought I'd see the day people cared enough to save it." The sound of pressure washers competed with the scrape of wire brushes as volunteers attacked years of rust and wear on the building's exterior. Former line supervisor Chuck, who'd confessed to the sabotage, worked alongside them, his shoulders bent as if carrying an invisible weight. But no one turned him away. Second chances were for everyone now. Maddie's camera caught it all. The determined faces, the careful repairs, the moments of shared laughter over bag lunches. She recorded quick interviews between tasks, collecting stories like precious stones. "What does Riverview mean to you?" she asked, person after person, each answer adding another thread to the tapestry of their community's story. By midweek, the changes were dramatic. Fresh paint brightened walls that hadn't seen care in decades. New safety signs gleamed. The break room sparkled, its ancient coffee maker replaced with a modern one donated by the diner owner who'd witnessed Dan's quiet stand against prejudice. The quilting circle worked in shifts, their banner growing larger and more beautiful by the day. Other women brought food, casseroles, sandwiches, thermoses of coffee, feeding the volunteers who came whenever they could spare time from their regular jobs. Tasha Brooks visited daily, rolling up her sleeves to work alongside everyone else. No one who saw her painting walls or hauling trash would guess she was the CEO. But then, titles meant less here now than the willingness to help. "My father was a janitor," she told Maddie during a water break, the girl's camera steady on her face. "He taught me that any work done with pride and purpose has dignity. That's what we're building here, not just a factory, but a place where everyone's contribution matters." The week flew by in a blur of activity. Every morning brought new volunteers. Every evening saw more progress. The plant's transformation became a symbol of the town's renewal, drawing curious visitors from neighboring communities who soon found themselves recruited into the effort. On Friday afternoon, Mrs. Jones and her quilters hung their completed banner across the entrance to the production floor. 20 feet long and shimmering with detailed needlework, it proclaimed Second Chance Line in letters that seemed to float above a background of intertwined hands of all colors. Workers gathered to admire it, many wiping tears from their eyes. Maddie filmed their reactions, her own camera work, steady despite her emotion. She'd captured over 20 hours of footage for her school project. But more importantly, she'd recorded the rebirth of hope in her community. Dan stood in the center of the main floor, taking in the changes. The old factory had never looked better, but it wasn't just the fresh paint and clean windows. There was a new spirit in the air, a sense of ownership and pride that no corporate mandate could have created. Around him, people were still working, fixing, cleaning, organizing. Former line workers explained procedures to new hires. Veterans traded stories with teenagers. The quilting circle had moved on to making new curtains for the break room. Every corner of the plant hummed with purpose and belonging. Watching it all, Dan felt something shift in his chest. The weight of worry he'd carried since that night in the parking lot with Tasha began to lift. Looking around at the bustling activity, he whispered, We're coming back stronger. The autumn morning sparkled with promise as the Riverview High School marching band struck up When the Saints Go Marching In. Their brass instruments gleamed in the sunlight, sending joyful notes bouncing off the factory walls. Workers gathered on the freshly painted steps, proudly wearing matching white t-shirts with "We Rise Together" stitched across their chests in bold blue letters. Mrs. Jones from the quilting circle had insisted on hand-stitching each shirt herself, saying machine work wouldn't carry the same blessing. Pastor Ruth Alvarez stood at the makeshift podium, her silver hair catching the light as she smiled at the crowd. Her weathered hands held her old Bible, its pages marked with colorful tabs from years of guidance and comfort. She watched as children darted between the long tables that lined the parking lot, their laughter mixing with the music. "In all my years serving this community," Pastor Ruth began, her voice carrying clear and strong, "I've never seen such a beautiful sight. Look around you. Every face here tells a story of persistence, of dignity, of hope restored." The tables groaned under the weight of covered dishes. Mrs. Martinez's enchiladas steaming beside Miss Sarah's fried chicken, Mr. Johnson's famous barbecue next to Mrs. Kim's bulgogi. The mingled aromas drew people together, just as the struggle to save their workplace had united them. Little Amy Chen, barely 6, chased her brother Tommy around a table piled high with desserts. Their mother, Janet, one of the Second Chance Line's first success stories, called out a gentle warning as they nearly toppled a tower of cupcakes decorated with tiny plastic tools. Pastor Ruth raised her hands, and the band's music softened. "Let us bow our heads," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Lord, we stand before you today not just as workers, but as family. Bless these hands that will labor here, hands that have known hardship and healing, hands that reached out to lift others when times were dark. Bless this place of second chances, where dignity grows alongside skill, where hope walks these halls alongside determination." Dan stood near the back, watching Maddie film everything with her tablet for her school project. She'd insisted on documenting every step of the renovation, calling it the Great Comeback Story. Her camera captured the moment Pastor Ruth stepped away from the podium to walk the length of the Second Chance Line, stopping to lay a hand on each workstation. "May every piece that moves through these stations carry with it the spirit of community," Pastor Ruth continued, touching the smooth metal surfaces. "May every person who works here know they belong, that their worth isn't measured just in quotas met, but in lives touched and barriers broken." The quilting circle had outdone themselves with the banner that now stretched across the main entrance. Second Chance Line, where community builds quality, stood out in bold letters, surrounded by squares that told the story of Riverview, the river that gave the town its name, the factory that gave it purpose, the people who gave it heart. Children played tag between the tables, their shoes leaving scuff marks on the freshly sealed parking lot. Nobody minded. Those marks would join the thousands of footsteps that had crossed this lot over the years, each one part of the factory's continuing story. Mrs. Jones pulled her grandson away from a third helping of cherry pie, smoothing his collar as she reminded him, "This isn't just a party, sugar. This is history being made right here in Riverview." Near the dessert table, veteran Jim Cooper shared stories with Marco Rodriguez, one of the returning citizens who'd proved himself on the line. They'd become unlikely friends during training, discovering they shared not just a knack for precision work but a deep belief in redemption. Tasha moved through the crowd, stopping to chat with each group, her usual corporate attire replaced by the same "We Rise Together" shirt everyone else wore. She paused beside Dan, who was helping an elderly worker to a seat with a loaded plate. The late morning sun had grown warm, but nobody seemed eager to move inside. The band transitioned to "Amazing Grace," and spontaneously, voices began to join in. The singing spread through the crowd like a gentle wave, harmony rising from different corners of the gathering. Pastor Ruth's voice carried over the singing as she concluded her blessing. "And may this line be more than machines and metrics. May it be a testament to what happens when we see each other as God sees us, worthy of grace, capable of growth, destined for purpose." The factory whistle that had called generations of workers to their shifts sounded sharp and clear above the music and chatter. This time, it wasn't marking the start of another long shift, it was announcing a new chapter in Riverview's story. The sound echoed off the buildings and rolled across the river that had given the town its name. People stopped mid-conversation, many with tears in their eyes. Some raised their coffee cups in toasts, others clasped hands with those standing nearby. The whistle's cry faded into a chorus of cheers that started soft and swelled until it seemed to fill the whole valley. Through tears of joy, workers embraced, veterans and newcomers, old-timers and fresh faces, all part of the same winning team. The sound of their celebration drowned out even the band, becoming a symphony of triumph that spoke of second chances realized and community restored. The morning celebration continued as Board Chairman Wilson stepped up to the makeshift podium set up near the factory entrance. The crowd quieted, workers and families drawing closer, their faces expectant. Potluck aromas wafted from the long tables behind them, mixing with the crisp autumn air. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wilson began, his voice carrying across the parking lot, "what happened here these past weeks isn't just a business success story. It's proof that when we trust in people, when we give everyone a fair chance, miracles happen." He paused, adjusting his reading glasses. "That's why the board has unanimously voted to create a new position, one that will ensure Riverview remains a model of community-based manufacturing." Dan stood near the back, one arm around Maddie's shoulders. He felt her squeeze his hand as Wilson continued. "I'm pleased to announce Dan Whitaker as our first Chief Community and Training Officer." The crowd erupted in applause. Mrs. Jones wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. Some of the second chance line workers whistled and cheered. Dan walked forward, his heart pounding. As he climbed the steps to the podium, he caught sight of his reflection in the factory windows, just a regular guy in a clean work shirt, trying his best to do right. The applause continued until he raised his hands. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But this isn't about me. It's about every person here who believed change was possible. It's about veterans who showed up early to mentor young hires. It's about folks who deserve second chances proving they only needed one. It's about a community that finally saw each other as neighbors instead of strangers." Wilson returned to the microphone. "We have one more announcement, Ms. Brooks." Tasha stepped forward, elegant in her navy suit, but with warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there months ago. "Riverview has shown what's possible when leadership serves the community. That's why I'll be splitting my time between corporate headquarters and here, helping develop the next generation of managers who understand that profit and purpose can work together." More applause, but Tasha wasn't finished. "And speaking of next generations, Maddie Whitaker has something to share." Maddie bounced up from her seat, clutching her tablet. Dan watched proudly as his daughter connected it to the portable projector they'd set up against the factory wall. The crowd turned to face the makeshift screen as the first image appeared. Mrs. Jones at her sewing machine, teaching a young man how to guide fabric through. "I interviewed everyone on the second chance line," Maddie explained, her voice clear and confident. "Because Dad always says every person has a story worth hearing." The documentary flowed from one face to another. There was Vernon, the Vietnam vet, describing how working alongside younger folks had helped his nightmares fade. Sarah, fresh from recovery, tears streaming as she showed the first paycheck she'd earned in 5 years. Chuck, voice breaking as he admitted his mistakes and found forgiveness. Between each story, Maddie had woven footage of the line in action, hands working together, voices encouraging, mistakes met with patience instead of scorn. The final sequence showed the workers' children drawing pictures of their parents at work, proud crayon illustrations of what their families could build together. When the screen faded to black, there was a moment of complete silence. Then Mrs. Jones stood up, her arthritis forgotten as she began to clap. Others joined, rising to their feet, until the whole crowd was standing, many wiping tears away. Maddie ducked her head, shy now that her work was done. But Dan saw Tasha walk over and whisper something that made his daughter beam. The formal ceremony wound down as Pastor Ruth offered a blessing, her strong voice carrying across the parking lot. "Let this place be known not just for what it makes, but for how it makes us better people." Workers began drifting toward the potluck tables, children darting between adults' legs. The high school band struck up again, this time playing a gentler tune. Dan watched his community mingling, old-timers and newcomers, people who might never have spoken now sharing recipes and stories. Under the massive Second Chance Line banner that stretched across the entrance, Dan found himself standing next to Tasha. They watched the scene before them in comfortable silence. Her hand rested on the railing near his, their fingers almost touching. "Thank you," she said softly, "for knocking on my window that night." Dan's hand shifted slightly closer to hers. "Thank you for having the courage to tell the truth." Their fingers brushed, just barely, a touch that held volumes of shared battles, quiet victories, and unspoken gratitude for finding an unexpected ally in each other's fight for something better. Above them, the banner rippled in the autumn breeze, its hand-stitched letters proclaiming the promise they'd helped their community keep. Second chances start with first steps together. The autumn evening painted long shadows across the Riverview Plastics parking lot. Dan Whitaker walked toward his truck after another full day of training sessions, his notebook tucked under his arm. The setting sun caught something familiar, a sleek black sedan parked in the same spot where everything had started months ago. His steps slowed as memories washed over him. That first night felt both recent and distant, like a photograph that had somehow faded and sharpened at the same time. Back then, he'd approached the car with uncertainty. Now, his stride carried the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he belonged. Tasha Brooks sat in the driver's seat, but this time her shoulders shook with laughter instead of sobs. Tears streamed down her face, but her smile lit up the interior of the car. Dan couldn't help but grin as he tapped gently on her window, the same gentle knock he'd used that fateful evening. She rolled down the window, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I probably look a mess again, don't I?" "Not crying this time?" Dan teased, leaning against the car door. "No," Tasha answered, her voice warm and steady. "Just grateful. So grateful, it spills out sometimes." Dan nodded, understanding perfectly. "I was just thinking about that first night. Mind if I join you for a minute?" Tasha gestured to the passenger seat, and Dan walked around to slide in beside her. The leather seat felt cool against his back, and the familiar scent of coffee, this time from her travel mug, filled the air between them. "You know what I remember most?" Tasha asked, turning slightly to face him. "Not the fear or the pressure from the board. I remember how you didn't treat me like the CEO or the boss. You just saw someone hurting." "Well," Dan chuckled softly, "my mama raised me right. Though I have to admit, I was pretty nervous offering the plant CEO my thermos of break-room coffee." "That coffee was terrible," Tasha laughed, the sound rich and free. "But it was exactly what I needed. Honest and unpretentious, just like you." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the factory walls in shades of gold and pink. The second shift workers were arriving, greeting each other with waves and friendly calls across the lot. "What you told me that night," Dan said quietly, "it saved more than just a plant." Tasha's eyes grew thoughtful. "And you saved more than jobs. You saved my faith in what leadership is really for." She gestured toward the factory. "Look at them out there. Veterans working alongside kids fresh out of high school. Former rivals sharing lunch breaks. People who never thought they'd get a second chance, now training others." Through the windshield, they watched Mrs. Jones, the elderly seamstress, showing a new hire how to properly clock in. The young man listened intently, nodding as she pointed out something on the time card. "Remember how scared everyone was that first week?" Dan asked. "Now look at them. Ownership changes everything, not just the legal kind, but the kind that comes from knowing you belong somewhere." "Speaking of belonging," Tasha said, reaching into her briefcase, "I wanted to show you something." She pulled out a glossy magazine, opened to a marked page. "Corporate Quarterly just came out. Look at the headline." Dan leaned closer to read. "Riverview Revolution: How One Plant's Second Chance Program Became a National Model." "They're sending teams from 3 other facilities next month," Tasha continued, her voice bright with pride. "They want to learn how we did it, how we turned charity work. Remember when they called it that? into the highest performing line in the company. Still can't believe we pulled it off sometimes, Dan admitted, shaking his head, especially after that fire, when everything seemed lost. We didn't pull it off alone, Tasha reminded him. Pastor Ruth's Truth, Finding Team, Maddie's documentary, the Quilting Circle's mentorship program, even Chuck coming clean about Kane's sabotage. Every piece mattered. Outside, the factory whistle sounded, its familiar tone echoing across the lot. Shift change was beginning, and the steady stream of workers continued, old and young, all backgrounds, all wearing the same proud expressions as they headed in to work. You know what makes me laugh now? Tasha said, gesturing to her tears. That night, I thought I was coming here to oversee an ending. Instead, I found a beginning. We all did. Dan nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The parking lot lights flickered on, one by one, casting warm circles of light across the pavement. The factory windows glowed from within, each one a testament to the lives being transformed inside. Sometimes the best endings aren't endings at all, he said softly. They're just better beginnings in disguise. Tasha smiled, touching his arm gently. Thank you, Dan, for that first knock on my window, for believing when others doubted, for showing me what real strength looks like. The whistle sounded again, its echo carrying across the evening air. Through the windshield, they watched the steady flow of workers, their family, moving with purpose and pride toward the building that had become so much more than just a factory. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Dan Whitaker, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.